Now, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a book that in some ways is quite like Exodus, in the sense that it talks a lot about what God has been doing with his people before the time they were in Egypt and when they were in Egypt and on the way from Egypt towards the Promised Land. And it talks a lot about God's expectations of his people, and it especially emphasizes the covenant relationship between God and Israel, which Exodus talks about, but Deuteronomy makes it the very framework for the book as a whole. And so what Deuteronomy does is systematically summarize the implications of what God has done for Israel in terms of who God is and how God relates to Israel and what God's expectations of Israel are. The book is set on the edge of the Promised Land. There's a whole generation passed since the time the people were in Egypt, because the people who came out of Egypt were rebellious, and so God said he was going to let them die off, and it would be their children who enter into the land. So that's why they've been living in the wilderness for that generation. Now they're on the edge of the land. Moses himself is about to die before the people go into the land, and in this gargantuan book he preaches his last sermon, which would have taken him quite a long time, as you can imagine, really, if one is to be literalistic about what's going on in this book. What Moses does is summarize the nature of the relationship between God and his people, and then summarize the various areas of expectation that God has of his people in a way that will be significant for the life of that they actually live in the land. And oftentimes the book is covering the same topics as Exodus has covered, but covering them in different kinds of ways. And we'll see how that's actually a typical feature of the way in which the Torah as a whole works. And what it points towards is the fact that the rules in the Torah are ones that receive different expression over the centuries and in different contexts, because different social contexts and different historical contexts required God to work out his rules in different ways. And so the Holy Spirit was guiding his people into seeing what it was God expected of them in different ways, in different contexts, as they handled questions about how do you deal with poverty? What's the nature of worship supposed to be? And how sometimes you're having to deal with topics that they didn't need to deal with the day before yesterday, as in Deuteronomy, for instance, questions like, how do you tell the difference between a true prophet and a false prophet? That's a new question later on in Israel's history that Deuteronomy has to help people to deal with. So in the course of the study, we'll be thinking about the way in which, in different contexts, God's principles need to be applied to the life of the people of God. That's Deuteronomy. Have a good time reading it.